I have always been fascinated by either pure language itself or the meaning that it conveys. We can use these models to parse news articles or read books that we cannot cover and draw inspirations and bring it back to us.
Welcome back to another episode of the AI Purity Podcast, the show where we explore the complex intersection of artificial intelligence, ethics, and its societal impact. On today's episode, we are thrilled to welcome a PhD researcher from the Max Planck Institute of Intelligent Systems. She is also an incoming assistant professor at the University of Toronto. She specializes in socially responsible NLP, where in her study, she combines causal and moral principles to make natural language processing models more robust, fair, and interpretable. Her impactful work has been featured in renowned publications like MIT News and ACM Tech News, and she actively contributes to the AI community through organizing workshops and mentorship programs. Join us as we dive into her groundbreaking research on using NLP for social good and discuss how we can make AI models safer and more ethically aligned. Welcome to the show, Zhijing Jin.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for the warm introduction. I'm glad to be here.
We're so happy to have you. How are you doing? Where are you in the world right now?
Good, good. I'm in Max Planck Institute in Germany now. So yeah, very quiet, research-oriented town called Tübingen.
That's amazing. And thank you for being here. I know we're on EST time and you are going to be part of the University of Toronto faculty very, very soon. Are you excited for that move?
Very much. I actually encountered Toronto Computer Science Department from last year. There was an ACL, so the largest NLP conference. And then I talked to Jeff Hinton, and he talked to me so enthusiastically and recommended me to apply. And now it worked. So I'm really happy about this.
That's really exciting. And I'm sure everyone at the University of Toronto will be so happy to have you join them in next year, 2025. Is it in June?
Yes, yes.
That's amazing. Well, could you tell us more about your educational path? How were you led to the Max Planck Institute and ETH in Zurich?
Sure. So I grew up in Shanghai, China, and then I did my undergraduate in the University of Hong Kong, where I got exposed to international research environment and various activities. And then after my undergrad, I was like, I have a very strong desire to continue academic. And then I thought about doing research. Among all the research at that time, AI was already a big topic. And among different branches of AI, at that time, I know that there are people doing computer vision, namely parsing image and videos. And there are also people doing robotics. However, I feel like we call it modality, like whether it's text, image, or robots or others, like the favorite modality that I like is language. So I was like, I need to do this language technology related AI, which is natural language processing, NLP.
What was it about language that made you want to choose that specific route when there were so many other factors of AI that was booming at the time?
Yeah, this is really a great question. Actually, at the time when I chose language, maybe computer vision had more popularity among the field. But for me, I have always been fascinated by either pure language itself or the meaning and the power that it conveys. By pure language, I am multilingual. Like when I moved to Hong Kong, I picked up Cantonese very quickly. And my PhD was in Germany and Switzerland, and both places, like both cities that I stayed in, speak German, and I pick up German also very fast. And it's just like the culture and the linguistic differences that fascinate me a lot. And other than that, for my NLP research, not only about the language as a format, but the semantics, the meaning that they convey. Like nowadays, we can use these models to parse news articles and summarize them for us, or read books that we in our lifetime cannot cover and draw inspirations and bring it back to us. I find that very fascinating.
It is very fascinating. I think the language technology, especially in the last 2 years with ChatGPT and everything, like it's just advanced so much. I feel like more people will only know about like AI from like 2 years ago, but you've been in the industry for much longer. Would you say that these LLM models, are they really the best at just the English language, or have they been making strides for other languages as well?
A lot of times when people talk about how ChatGPT and other large language model work, at least the original version was that they just like dump all the internet to it. So like we would among us colloquially call it accidentally multilingual. So in the vanilla version, in the earlier version, because different websites are in different languages, so the more text it has, for example, the languages with majority of speakers like English, French, Spanish, Chinese, German. ChatGPT also pick up that very well. Although I think nowadays the most research investments are concentrating on a small group of languages. So that's why their quality, if you ask them to like polish your text, generate a report in English, it still works the best. In Chinese, it's comparable. However, if we move to some more low resource languages, you might see like grammatically incorrect sentences. That's a little bit like lack of effort in addressing that.
Do you think in the near future, for other foreign languages other than English, like there would be LLMs that would be just as good as the ones that are performing right now?
Right. There are two ways for it to be good. One is that people who speak that language or have products or have application in that language put enough efforts so that these models are fine-tuned or polished to speak very well in that language. The other way is that maybe there is a path towards a universal representation shared across many languages. So once it does well in major languages, maybe it just need a we would call it decoder, or like it's just need a maybe for a more intuitive understanding, just need a translation to turn the same semantics into the local expression.
That's really fascinating. And in your research, you focus on causality and moral principles in natural language processing. Was there a specific experience or challenge in your career that pushed you toward that research?
I think there are multiple reasons. I always have a profound interest in philosophy. And then one of the reasons, like when I need to choose my PhD research topic, there are many aspects of language and natural language processing. And I was thinking like, okay, should I do this specific application? But then later, after many iterations, I'm like, I really want to address some fundamental problems that progress our knowledge of the world. And then I realized that I'm so fascinated by this, like, what's the causal effect? It can date from Aristotle time where he classified there are different, like four different types of causality. It could also be about Newton's fundamental question about why apples fall. And also many reasons like modern world questions such as for job admission or salary, do gender cause a different admission decision? And these are all super relevant questions that I care about, and I'm just excited to use NLP to solve them. Yeah, so that's the causality part. And my passion for morality actually emerged in the middle of my PhD. Because for a long time I was thinking like, okay, how do we solve objective questions and so on? But then I realized also with the rising power of AI, we need to address a lot of questions that are maybe you can do action A and you can do action B, both lead to their own consequence, like their effects. But then, like, do you choose A over B or B over A? Then that's a question about what do you care about? What do you think is right for you and for the society? And that leads to like my interest into this profound field of morality.
It is really fascinating. I mean, how has your background influenced your perspective in integrating social responsibility into AI research?
I guess my background is more into STEM, but since childhood, I've been very interested for the humanities aspect, and also throughout my childhood, school period, now research period, I've always devoted my time to different types of volunteering work. And turning it into more recent actions, I organize NLP for social good workshops where we gather hundreds of researchers and discuss how these research can be used to benefit humanities or prevent their harm, potential harm on humanities. And on the other side, I also, yeah, do run a lot of mentorship events and then try to also see how we can broadcast some right values into the next generation. So these are all topics that are very close to my heart.
I did want to ask you about that, the work that you do for NLP for social good. For those listening out there who haven't heard about it before, could you explain to us what exactly is NLP for social good?
Yes, yes. So basically, where we start from is basically this language technology of AI, and we wonder two directions. One is there are already a lot of pressing problems in society. It could be things like how do we have fair educational resources? How do we have accessible healthcare to more people? Or how do we solve poverty problems? And then it's about now that we have the new technology, can we use that as an engine also to make the way we address these urgent problems more efficient and more effective? One example for such is, I guess, with ChatGPT, it's become more and more evident. Nowadays, educational resources can be more freely accessible, and you probably don't need to spend a lot to recruit a private math tutor, but a lot of iterations using ChatGPT as an AI tutor can let a lot more students access these resources. Same for other domains. And the other side is more about how to mitigate the bias brought by them and make them harmless and benefit more.
Because I know when people think about NLP, they usually think, okay, it's a way, like you said earlier, the example of, books that we would never be able to read in our entire lifetime, but we can use this technology to understand and gather the specific, contents of that book. So when people think about NLP, it's only for language. But I wanted to ask you, how do you envision NLP to create positive societal impacts over the next decade?
Great questions. So as I mentioned, some examples of education and the overarching framework that me and my collaborator and many other fantastic researchers deal with is this United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And then, as we know, education is one of them, healthcare is another of them, and then there are other things like poverty, climate change, and maybe gender equality, and so on. Just sharing some of my motivation for how NLP and also my specific interest in causality can help poverty problems is a little bit about decision making. So if we trace back to the 2021 Nobel Economics Prize, one of the winners actually is renowned for their work on whether increasing minimum wage will affect people in social economically disadvantaged class. Will it really benefit them or harm them? So it's a sort of causal effect. And I would also be curious about using NLP, either ChatGPT or many other things, to gather data about people's employment status, people's need that they express through survey or through online platforms, and use causal inference to attribute if government want to implement a policy, what's the predicted effect of that? And should we invest resource into that? So that's one concrete example of, yeah, the power of technology, more informed decision making.
So, in my understanding, it not only streamlines the process of making decisions, but it also makes sure that you're making the correct decisions, basically.
Yes, yes.
Your research focus also is on causal NLP. Could you walk us through that work and its significance for model robustness and fairness?
Sure, definitely. So, just giving some more reader-friendly beginner-friendly examples. Let's say bias could be like gender bias is a special case of fairness, and also fairness is quite related to this so-called robustness. But in simple words, it could be such as like if LLMs were to give suggestions, maybe how to judge a candidate profile or how to provide a medical suggestion, well, maybe not the final judge on the thing, but to provide some assistive opinions, then like fairness or gender bias in this case is about what if the patient is a woman instead of a man, or what if the patient or what if the job candidate is a woman? And it's sort of like challenging AI's ability to judge such examples on the same ground. For example, judging a candidate by their real skill set, previous education background, previous job background, instead of putting any weight on the gender or any other demographic background. So that's an intuitive example. And there are many other applications of AI where the input has some information about gender. And we really want AI models to be as accurate as they should be in the majority group. And also, maybe for some really sensitive decisions, they should base it on the real causes, like the fair criteria that should be taken into consideration.
And how do we make sure that these AI models are trained to be not biased? And how do we make sure that, they are able to make those correct decisions?
Right, that's a great question. So I would say that it's very hard to make them really fair in the training process. And a lot of times, let's say if I were OpenAI or Anthropic or these big companies training LMs, then that means maybe injecting certain losses, like, well, by loss, it's more about training objectives to constrain these models. Or if we're using some pre-trained model and let them judge a new case, then there are some engineering tricks or post-processing tips to encourage fairness. One example is that nowadays, when we use ChatGPT and ask a lot of gender-sensitive questions, sometimes it stays very politically correct. Okay, gender is not a factor here. We should also encourage female presence here, and I would suggest something, something. So that's usually a result of some maybe reinforcement learning with human feedback, a technique to steer the model towards more equality. And there are also some other tricks or other adjustments to ensure large language models behave more fairly.
And what would you say are some of the common failures modes of NLP models that causal NLP can help identify?
I guess if causal NLP is used to, as mentioned, like fairness, and then as its generalization of robustness, then fairness basically tries to detect under what condition any of the demographic information serves as a cause for an AI output that shouldn't depend on that. And then robustness actually is a factor, like is a problem of whether any other hints, maybe, for example, what's the language style that you put into these models, or what is the personality of the user that expressed in the way they pose a question, and whether a model is like provides consistent answer towards that. For that, we have a lot of tests to perturb or either paraphrase the model input by different style or specifically inject personality traits to represent people from different backgrounds and check whether model response change given that. Yeah, so these are some ways, and the essential form is to check what serves as a cause for model to change their predictions and outputs.
And how does causal inference help interpret and enhance model performance?
There are several ways. I guess for the field called interpretability, then it's mostly caring about if model already generates outputs in a certain way, can we see like maybe where it in its internal mechanisms contribute to that, just to resonate with the previous comment on fairness and robustness. There is also a way to interpret whether models are really fair by looking into let's say, as we know, the underlying architecture for Transformer, which is the backbone of ChatGPT and many large language models, the underlying architecture there consists a lot of neurons, like how human brains works. Like we have a lot of neurons in our brain, and we check whether in these artificial neurons of the large language models, whether it encodes gender at first, like after parsing the user input, and also whether it uses gender for its following decision. So that type of causal chain in its decision making can be detected by causal NLP. And another direction other than that is that we really want LLM to give more reliable decision making. So to enhance its behavior, we also explicitly have instructions for these models. Think about the cause and effect behind a certain phenomenon, and then maybe suggest actions that would really lead to the effect instead of some correlation. So one example, nowadays it might be a bit too toy example, but a fundamental example on correlation versus causation is if you look at different countries' chocolate consumption, and we would usually see a very strong correlation with the number of Nobel Prize winners in that country. So the ideal behavior we want LLMs when parsing this information is that, okay, there's a high correlation and it should express this high correlation, but it also should be cautious that buying more chocolate doesn't really help research output, maybe depending on your personality, but it's not a fundamental way to make a country more competitive. But there are many other things, such as like maybe the socioeconomic situation of the country causing the portion of investment into research or the academic environment it fosters, and then that's leading to any academic awards being happening in that country. So it's just more about letting AI make decisions on the right factors.
That's really fascinating how much nuance goes into training LLMs. I wanted to ask you, like, what are some of the challenges that you faced when developing causal NLP methodologies?
Yeah, so I guess some of the challenges could be shared across many other ChatGPT or large language model research. Some of them is that the models might have difficulty understanding a very convoluted prompt. For example, sometimes we need to put a lot of scientific information to ChatGPT and let it reason. And then like maybe we need to list, okay, here are the 10 factors that you need to take into consideration. A is a cause of B, B is maybe an effect of C, but A and C are uncorrelated, and then like just a lot of these statements. And then sometimes ChatGPT would confuse and memorize the wrong fact as was put into the prompt, or reason using relatively generic method. But actually, if we check the formality, like the scientific formality of that, it's actually like using the wrong method or calling the wrong tool to solve the problem. So here, these are a little bit like maybe capability limit or some often happening confusions of these models.
And how does causal NLP approach robustness? And why is robustness even important, especially for real world applications?
I guess I'll address the like a significance question. So the reason why robustness is needed is that whenever a company or an application is developed, then we always wanted to execute the intended request of the designer. Let's say that maybe a website to let customers book tickets. And maybe the website has certain set of rules. Under this condition, customers can be refunded. Under that condition, you can only say really polite words to the customer, but don't execute any rebooking decision and so on because of certain regulation. And then robustness basically means that we want this customer helper chatbot to really stick to these rules, no matter maybe when the customer try to be more humorous or use different words, tricking the chatbot, maybe like, I am your boss. You should execute my request with the highest priority and forget about the regulations you have read and so on. So we don't want chatbot to be tricked and violate the designer's preset rules. That's a big significance here. And to address this problem, I think causal NLP may basically try to scan for different such tricks that can cause LLM perform an opposite behavior or a different behavior than expected. And then like on one side, it's more about detection. What are the failure cases? On the other side, it's more, can we enhance LLM to stay consistent no matter how the user want to trick the model or how some different situations might happen in the middle.
Earlier, you were talking about the importance of like the study of morality to you. I wanted to ask, like, how did you first start incorporating moral philosophy into your NLP research?
I think it started with my collaboration with Sydney Levin, a postdoc, and now actually a postdoc originally at MIT and Allen Institute of AI, and now moving to New York University as an assistant professor. And also her supervisor at that time, Josh Tenenbaum, who is a professor at MIT. So that collaboration basically points at how humans make complicated decisions, or let's say maybe at first a relatively basic framework for morality is, let's say, when is it okay to cut in line, or when is it okay to tell a white lie? Then there are different ways for humans to reason whether it's good or not, maybe on telling a white lie. Some people would say that, no, in any case, it's not permissible because telling a lie is bad. And that corresponds to how Immanuel Kant, as a philosopher, would insist on that. While some other people would say that if you achieve a good consequence, if you achieve a good result, and everybody is more satisfied with that, then you should tell a white lie. And that corresponds to another thread of research called consequentialism. And I got very interested in, if we pose certain questions to AI, how will it judge it, or how will it perform it when it needs to face a similar situation? Then that's the point where Sydney, Josh, and many other collaborators join, and we explore how to build a moral framework that is both principled, calling these basic rules that has been well investigated in history, but also flexible in that given a very new situation that we have never modeled before, but AI has to judge on the fly, how can it make a really reasonable decision?
And can you share some examples of morally challenging questions that you've posed to NLP models?
Yes. There are several, and one of our study, which was published in Europe's 2022 as an oral, actually investigates like these moral exceptions. There, we look into when is it okay for a customer to cut the line, and should AI stop that, or should AI allow that, as well as some other similar like exception making questions. Whereas another recent study that we have done is for social media platforms, whether a content moderation decision should be made or not. And that it's an NLP problem because it takes as an input a social media post. And it has an output about, should we let the post be out there on the internet, or should it be moderated, and the platform would probably not let the post be shown. And that's also a very tricky and morally challenging question as well.
Do you think NLP models, since your research have advanced a little bit, have their reasoning gotten better, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. The landscape of AI research is really proceeding rapidly, and I guess many different companies are on the frontier. But at the point of this podcast, the OpenAI O1 was really much better than earlier models on challenging reasoning tasks. So that's like very surprising to see.
And could you share examples of real-world applications of your work that have contributed to positive social outcomes?
Yeah, so I guess our work is still a little bit more academic, but we do investigate real world related problems. And one of the studies that I really like is at COVID time, we look into the causal effect of social media opinion, social media sentiment on the lockdown policies. And we actually control for many different confounders, such as the infection rate and employment rate and many others. And we actually draw political insights on which area the policy making, in which area the policy making is actually a strong function of people's opinion, and in which other area it's like a more agnostic towards social media opinion, but actually more as a result of the actual social need from infection rate and employment rate and so on, many others.
Well, since most of your research goes into like training LLMs and NLP, I wanted to get your perspective on AI text detectors and their safety. I wanted to get your opinion on the role of AI text detectors in today's digital landscape.
I think that's really a great problem, and it's very relevant for today's society. Mainly, like nowadays, either for news articles, for maybe student assignments, and many others, it's really confusing whether something is really written by humans and whether we should trust that because there's somebody responsible for it, or that it's actually generated machine by machine, and actually there's maybe less credibility in that because it's just more automatically generated and not it doesn't hold responsibility. So I guess like these detectors really help us distinguish the two cases, and then later the readers would have different trust values given this information, and also the websites, or later if someone needs to attribute responsibility, they would know how to legally resolve it.
Yeah, because for us, AI Purity, when ChatGPT first started 2 years ago, we realized that students are, using this technology and essentially misusing this technology because we understand that, ChatGPT, it's a great tool for research. It can help students with homework, of course, but there are also harmful ways to use the tool by plagiarizing AI work, for example. And now, since we've been talking about the advancements of these LLMs and these AI tools, like they can even potentially be good at moral reasoning, and it'll be harder and harder for educators and other people to distinguish between what is AI generated text and what is human written text. And especially for you, since you will be joining the faculty of University of Toronto, is it something that you're afraid of? Like, how would you address the use of AI tools amongst your students, especially when they are misusing it?
This is a very challenging question. And I also believe that in today's labor market, or in educators, from education point of view, there are maybe two types of cases. One is that one is more usually from the view of the employers, and we just need people to complete this task. What tool you use, we don't care about it. And then, but from the educator point of view, it's more about we want students, even without the existence of tools, they need to have a right opinion on certain things. They need to know how we would reliably and manually complete this task, so that even in the future, if they want to use the tool, they can still use it in a more responsible way. As you mentioned, like this type of detectors will be very useful for judging students' assignments, understanding like whether they really pick up the knowledge by heart or are relying on external tools when they're not supposed to do so. And personally, I am also thinking about maybe prior to the assignments, we will have an exercise session to let students sort of stay as an adversarial to point out what are the problems in these GPT-generated answers and implant in them some crucial, I don't know, shortcomings of these models so that maybe in the future, not only we have a strong, let's say, police checking whether such contents are generated, but we also want the users be aware of, okay, they look sketchy and I should be aware of the potential risks.
Just in the context of social good, since we were talking about that earlier, what do you think about AI tools being used all throughout the internet? Like there are tools where you can upload your photo and then the AI will, edit it for you, or even AI text detectors, like you're essentially giving your data, right? And it is being stored somewhere where if it's not a reputable platform, we're not exactly sure where the data goes. Because I've talked to some professors out there that say professors essentially shouldn't use AI text detectors because the essays are written by their students and it is their intellectual property. So technically, they kind of don't have a right to feed the students' data into a third-party platform, essentially. So I wanted to get your take in the context of social good. Like, what do you think about those AI tools where you can like input your text or input your photos? Does it have any challenges for its users? Should people out there be more wary about using these AI tools? I wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, as you have just mentioned, there are concerns from both data privacy, like no matter how good or bad the answer is, the action of putting your information or other people's information into these engines is problematic. And also, like as mentioned, the generated outputs might also have certain risks. Maybe they are not true and maybe they offend certain groups and so on. And on the formal side, as we just newly mentioned, this data privacy problem and so on, it definitely will cast big social impacts, especially nowadays. Maybe everybody know ChatGPT, but not everybody know many other LLMs. So that will mean that for these people who, for the majority of the people who use one or two type of services, then all their data is at the hands of these companies. And we don't have evidence yet, but there's no real guarantee or there's no strong proof that they haven't been using customer data to improve their next version of the model, or whether at a future point these data would be released to certain parties and so on.
I agree. And thank you for that. I wanted to get your advice for maybe developers out there for the future of AI tools, and also wanted to ask you about the workshops and the community engagement that you've been doing. What key principles should developers keep in mind when creating AI tools for public use?
I guess several fundamental principles. We actually had a discussion about that last week in California, where in a workshop of a bunch of AI researchers, where Professor Joshua Bendrell from MILA, so Montreal, Canada, was also there. And then we were discussing basically this issue on what should companies hold responsibilities for. Of course, as mentioned, like there is data privacy issue, where I think actually Germany is doing much better than the US does. And then there are also things such as, can we allow it to generate risky contents? And the risky contents could be defined in many sense, but technically there are two formats. One is text only, that can be in the format, well, the most risky format of things could be maybe some chatbot might persuade its user to have suicide, and that's really irresponsible. Certain dating large language models and so on. And then on the other side, there could also be tailored content production. And some of them could be driven by commercial interest to make users more likely to spend money on a certain thing, or some of them can be fitting political interest. Then it really needs to be cautious, like whether it's manipulating our society in an undesired way. And apart from text output, another type of output is code. So basically command to execute certain things in a system. Currently, ChatGPT can generate code that call Google, and that can maybe perform Google search. It might also, if developers link it with certain API, it could also call agents to book flights, restaurant for you, or I don't know whether it's out yet, but there are also risks of agents manipulating bank things. Apart from that, a long-term risk is what if certain government officials weren't cautious enough and connected with some infrastructure systems. Maybe some train schedule, flight schedule would be disturbed when ChatGPT generates some suggested either display or actual way how it functions. Or what if electricity system has a fundamental bug, but that bug was or intentional or unintentional is provided by large language models. These are very risky outcomes.
Could you share some of those regulations that Germany has been putting in place to, for example, make companies make them more accountable? Because I know EU has also been making strides in regulating AI more than the US. So could you share some of the regulations that they've set in place for AI?
Germany in general has a very strong GDPR, like some data protection. And also like at my affiliations, Max Planck Institute and ETH, both have preferences of storing data locally. And then we need to be very cautious when using US originated technology, sharing different things. I guess maybe more detailed things could be consulted for a person with a better legal background. But for us, I would trust a German app or website or function a lot more in that when it mentioned I will delete customer data after I use it, like I would trust that action more.
You've organized numerous workshops on NLP for positive impact, moral AI, and more. What has been the most important goals of these workshops for you?
It's really a combination of both research and advocate work. So I guess research-wise, had these workshops not been there, then normally people just notice you by the paper you publish, by the institute you are at, and so on. However, with workshops, especially at those large conferences, for example, I also have upcoming ones at EMNLP, which is an NLP conference with thousands of attendees, and also workshops at NeurIPS this year will be held in Vancouver in Canada, and that will probably have more than 20,000 audiences, like attendees. And there, like having my workshop or many others, like having a workshop on the official schedule and having attendees like researchers or non-researchers like joining and hearing all these themed talks or themed presentations, that really brings this as a keyword to the community, and people would like be aware of the keyword that NLP should be paired together with social impact, or this concept of morality, either moral philosophy or moral psychology, could be connected with future AI development. So that really grasps some voice in the community and make the next generation of researchers more aware of that.
I think it is very important work, especially for the next, round of socially responsible NLP researchers, because this is essentially such a powerful tool that we can use. It's such a powerful technology that is able to, like you said earlier, help us make decisions for really important societal issues. So I think it's really important that you help not only train the models, but actually train the developers to care about the social impact of these tools. And as a developer and a researcher, how would you say developers can foster user trust in AI tools, especially when deploying them in very sensitive areas?
I guess before user trust, it should be more on like developers should responsibly build them. And before that responsibility or that formal verification that this is really reliable and so on, before that thing is out, it's fine that the user don't trust them for the moment. Let's wait for a few years, wait for strong evidence. Yeah, before AI can really be integrated into, as we mentioned, sensitive areas. Maybe generating an essay, depending on its application cases, sometimes it's a low-stake task, but executing a command, generating things that hundreds of thousands of people will see, that definitely at the moment, need human checkers, if not fully, held responsible by human, apart from the AI usage. And I hope in the future we can really confidently say that this is trustable, this company is very aligned with the social values that we care about. Then we encourage the next generation of people like more comfortably use that.
And for future directions and challenges in NLP, what do you foresee are some of the challenges or challenges you anticipate in expanding NLP research to be more socially responsible?
There could be many challenges. There are challenges about the technology and challenges about the people. The technology could be about overcoming, as we mentioned, the bias issues, inaccuracy issues, and so on. The challenges about people is about whether they will prioritize safety research, social responsibility research over fancy demos to attract investors and generate commercial interest right away with an immature technology. Yeah, and apart from commercial interests, there are also national security interests. So the alignment of that and more socially responsible use of NLP is crucial to this topic.
And are there specific advancements or new technologies that you believe will shape the future of NLP?
There are a lot of promising ones. And just to highlight a few, I guess this robustness research, and the more technical term is nowadays is called like jailbreaking research, where people attack the models of like attack the large language model and defense to make the models like robust against whatever perturbation that are maliciously inducing model do a certain behavior. So that's one thing, making them more robust and safe. The other thing is interpretability, like namely, we should know how models make these decisions, and not only for developers, but also share it with users so that they can really understand what is this chatbot doing. Apart from that, I think a lot of specific application areas need to define their own standards, regulations, and so on. And then that should pair with developers' work to strictly execute these principles to future developments. So I hope with all of these in place and the right, as mentioned, alignment, more social responsible AI will occur.
I wanted to ask you, like, do you think regulation worldwide for AI tools is a process that is incoming? Like, is it something that is in the works at the moment?
There are definitely a lot of efforts trying to do that. There are also huge frictions in that violates some other people's interest. I think with Joshua Bendrell and many other Canadian researchers, they're pushing the Canadian AI Safety Institute, calling for more responsible AI there. So we'll have a big hope for Canada to progress on this direction. And then a lot of challenging bits also lies in many international competitors, in that for US and for China, they have their own way of how regulations work and what are some other forces that need to be balanced and so on. So it will be a challenging thing overall internationally.
And in your opinion, I know we were talking earlier about how to mitigate model bias, but what are the steps that we are necessary to create models that align better with ethical and social standards?
I guess some of the things is there are different ways to achieve it. I know that some large language models write a very long prompt before the user query saying that you are a very fair model, you hold responsibility, and so on. Then when user try to induce some racism or sexism, then such requests would be rejected, and a more politically correct view would be expressed by the models. However, as mentioned, these things are also subject to jailbreaking. There could be different ways to trick models to still violate fairness principles. Then for that, I think so far the most promising approach is to pair both interpretability research and bias reduction research. So interpretability research is on like where exactly does model store gender, race, and many other demographic information, and what are some certain circuits within the model, certain mechanism within the model that use it. Maybe after we remove these mechanisms entirely within the model, then no matter how user probe it, it cannot induce an ability that model doesn't have. So it's like providing producing a surgery on the models to remove these harmful bits. Some others are defense technology, so mainly like testing over a vast set of possible ways to trick the model, and still like that's sort of on the behavioral level, try to let models be aware of, okay, here are all the ways you can be tricked, remember them, be cautious next time. That's also like an ongoing big direction for developers.
And looking forward, what are some of the emerging research areas within socially responsible NLP that excite you?
Yeah, I think there are many. I guess in the last part of the podcast until now, we have talked a lot on different mitigation, like AI risk mitigation strategy. On top of that, I really think that we should act proactively. So there is a majority of people caring about AI safety. And then on the other side, we can use so there are words on like narrow AI, which means very constrained type of AI application, maybe just putting a piece of text and ask it to give all the event names that are produced in the text or list the maybe the human needs expressed in this piece of text and so on. So we still use AI to deal with very specific small piece of task. In that case, it can be usually much more reliable and in a more control setting. And it's nice to use these little reliable tools on, as mentioned, these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I would be very curious about policymaking using AI to actually parse data of like survey results and parse data of maybe certain social media platforms to provide information for policymakers. And some other things could also be about for healthcare, there are electronic healthcare health record use LM to extract the past symptoms the patient generate, certain keywords in the medical history so that the doctors can be more aware of them and so they can try to keep the quality but help more patients given their limited work time. So these are all very good areas that I highly look forward to.
Thank you so much for all those amazing examples of like real world applications of these AI tools. I think you do an amazing work with the research that you do. And I'm really excited that you were here to share your time with the podcast. Before I let you go, is there anything that you'd like to share with our audience right now? Maybe a message for developers or maybe a message for AI users out there? Anything at all that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I guess for AI users, try to be aware whenever you use ChatGPT and give it very constrained settings and don't share your personal data too much. Especially also for students, try to earn as much skills on yourself, like independent of what technology there are. And when you get into the job market, there are numerous chances you can use them. But while you are in a critical period of acquiring all these skills, try to hold the right attitude with these AI tools. And then for developers and so on, I just want to have a shout out for the preparation of the Canadian AI Safety Institute and that many awesome researchers in Canada around the world are doing. And also at University of Toronto, there are amazing progress on both developing more strong capabilities of AI to help various areas of life and also responsible AI research. Yeah, I personally also look forward to working with many awesome researchers at U Toronto and across Canada, as well as interacting with students.
Thank you so much, Ji Jingjin, for gracing our podcast, for the time and the valuable insights you've shared with us. And of course, thank you everyone for joining us on this enlightening episode of the AI Purity Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed uncovering the mysteries of AI generated text and the cutting edge solutions offered by AI Purity. Stay tuned for more in depth discussions and exclusive insights into the world of artificial intelligence, text analysis, and beyond. Don't forget to visit our website, that's www.ai-purity.com, and share this podcast to spread the word about the remarkable possibilities that AI Purity offers. Until next time, keep exploring, keep innovating, and keep unmasking the AI. Goodbye.